In the winter of 1306, if you had walked along the walls of Berwick Castle, on the border between England and Scotland, you would have seen a woman hanging in a cage. She was Isabella Macduff, Countess of Buchan, and her crime was that she had placed the crown on the head of Robert the Bruce. For that, the King of England had ordered her shut inside a latticed cage of timber and iron, fixed to the outside of one of the castle towers, open to the wind and the rain and the eyes of every passer-by, and there she was to stay, not for a day, not for a season, but for years. A short ride away, at Roxburgh, another cage held another woman, Mary Bruce, the new king's sister. It was a punishment designed with great care, not a quick death which would have made a martyr, but a slow, public, humiliating display. A high-born woman turned into a caged animal on a wall for a nation to look at and learn from. The king who gave that order was Edward I of England. And history has decided to call him great. It calls him the Lawgiver, the father of the English Parliament, the builder of the most magnificent castles in Europe, the towering warrior they nicknamed Longshanks. Even the film that made him famous to the modern world cast him as a brilliant, formidable villain, a man to be feared and somehow admired. It is a portrait built to command respect, and it is a portrait with a great deal carefully left out, because behind the statues and the castles stands the king who expelled an entire people from England, the first monarch in Europe to do such a thing, the king who had a prince hanged, drawn and quartered, and a patriot disembowelled alive, the king who broke two nations and hung women in cages to prove he had. This is the story of the real Edward, not the great king of the textbooks, but the cold and merciless one behind the crown, and the darkness that the little word great was built to hide. To understand the man who caged a countess, you have to begin with a boy watching his father fail, and deciding very early and very completely that he would never be weak in the way his father was weak. Edward was born in June of 1239 at the Palace of Westminster, the eldest son of King Henry III and his Queen Eleanor of Provence. He was named, pointedly, after Edward the Confessor, the saint king his father worshipped, for Henry III was a pious, artistic, and deeply unwarlike man, a king happier commissioning the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey than commanding an army, and a ruler whose long reign was a slow catalogue of misjudgment, favoritism, and humiliation. Henry loved beautiful things and trusted the wrong people, spent money he did not have on schemes that came to nothing, and packed his court with his wife's foreign relatives until his own barons rose against him. He was, by most measures, a failure as a king, and his son grew up watching it happen. The boy who watched was nothing like the father. Where Henry was slight and gentle, Edward grew into a giant, well over 6 feet tall, which in the 13th century made him tower over almost every man he met, and earned him, later, the nickname Longshanks, Longlegs. He was powerfully built, athletic, a formidable horseman and soldier, with black hair that would turn white with age, and a slight droop to his left eyelid that he had inherited from his father, and that gave his stare, in anger, a peculiar and frightening quality. And he had a temper, a towering, sudden, physical rage that men who served him for decades never stopped being afraid of. He was intelligent, energetic, and utterly without his father's softness. From the beginning, Edward believed in strength, in mastery, in the hard exercise of power, precisely the things his father had lacked. His early manhood was not, however, a straight line of noble purpose. It was, in fact, a study in ruthlessness and shifting loyalty. In the great crisis of Henry's reign, the Barons' War, when a faction of reforming nobles led by Simon de Montfort tried to force the king to share his power with a council and a parliament, the young Edward moved from side to side with a coldness that unsettled everyone. At times he supported the reformers, at times he betrayed them. He gave his word and broke it. He made alliances of convenience and abandoned them the moment they ceased to be convenient. Even by the flexible standards of medieval politics, the young Lord Edward earned a reputation as a man whose promises meant exactly nothing. A leopard, one contemporary called him, brave as a lion but, like the leopard, unreliable and treacherous, changing his spots as it suited him. He was learning the trade of power, and the lesson he was taking from it was not honor. It was that winning was the only thing that mattered, and that the man who hesitated, who kept faith when faith was costly, was the man who lost. He proved how thoroughly he had learned it in the summer of 1265 at a small Worcestershire town called Evesham. Simon de Montfort, having beaten and captured the king the year before, effectively ruled England, and held Henry III and for a time Edward himself as prisoners. but Edward escaped, gathered the royalist forces, and outgeneraled the older man completely. He trapped Montfort's army in a loop of the river Avon on rising ground, with no line of retreat, and he did something that tells you everything about the kind of soldier and the kind of man he had become. He had a picked squad of knights swear to seek out Montfort himself and kill him. No ransom, no capture, no quarter for one of the greatest noblemen in Europe. This was not how the wars of the medieval aristocracy were supposed to be fought. Noblemen captured other noblemen and ransomed them. That was the system, and it kept the killing among the great relatively rare. Edward threw that system away. Evesham was not a battle so much as an execution. Montfort's smaller force was overwhelmed and slaughtered, many of them cut down as they tried to surrender, and Montfort was hacked down where he stood. And then came the part that shocked even a violent age. Edward's men did not simply kill Simon de Montfort. They mutilated his corpse. They cut off his head and his hands and his feet and his genitals, and the head, with the severed genitals draped over the face, was sent as a trophy to the wife of one of Edward's allies. A chronicler of the time called it the murder of Evesham. For battle it was none. Montfort, whatever his faults and ambitions, had been the champion of parliamentary reform, a man many ordinary people regarded almost as a saint, and his broken, dismembered body was Edward's answer to him. It was a message written in flesh, and the message was simple. This is what happens to those who stand against me. There will be no chivalry, there will be no mercy, there will only be the total, humiliating, exemplary destruction of my enemies. It is worth pausing on Evesham, because everything that follows is already visible in it. The willingness to break the rules of his own class when the rules were inconvenient, the preference for annihilation over compromise, the instinct for the theatrical, exemplary cruelty, the head on a spike, the body displayed, the punishment designed not just to end an enemy but to terrify everyone watching. The countess in the cage, 40 years later, is Evesham's direct descendant. So is the prince dragged through the streets to be disembowelled, and the patriot's quartered body scattered across the island, and the whole people driven into exile. The young man at Evesham had discovered the thing that would make him, in the eyes of history, great. That terror, applied without hesitation and on a sufficient scale, works. It breaks resistance, it gets results. His father had been merciful and irresolute, and had nearly lost his throne. Edward would be neither, and he would build one of the strongest monarchies in Europe on that difference. He would spend the rest of his life proving that the leopard could hold what the lion could only dream of taking, but the boy who had watched his father humiliated had already learned the lesson that would define him, that mercy was weakness, and weakness was the one thing he would never forgive in his enemies or in himself. And he would carry that lesson to a throne, and to a crusade, and at last to a whole island that would learn to fear the sound of his name. The blood of Evesham had scarcely dried before the young Lord Edward turned his face toward a different kind of war. He did not rush to seize the crown that would one day be his. His father still lived, and England, cowed by the annihilation of Simon de Montfort's faction, lay quiet beneath a royalist peace that Edward himself had imposed with the sword. For the first time in a generation there was nothing left at home to conquer. And so the restless prince went looking for glory in the one arena where a Christian king could still win it clean, untainted by the squalor of civil war, the Holy Land. In the summer of 1270, he took the cross and sailed east on the venture that history would come to call the Ninth Crusade. It was, by any sober measure, a doomed enterprise. The great age of crusading was guttering out. The Christian holdings along the Levantine coast had dwindled to a handful of battered ports, and the Mamluk Sultan Baybars was reducing them one by one, patiently like a man closing his fist. Louis of France, the movement's last royal champion, died of disease outside Tunis before Edward could even join his fleet. What remained when the prince finally reached Acre in the spring of 1271 was a remnant, a scattering of knights clinging to the walls of a dying kingdom while the sea of Islam closed over it. For most who came, it was a pilgrimage into futility. For Edward, it was a stage, and he meant to be seen upon it doing the work of God with a blade in his hand. In truth, he achieved little that would outlast him. His force was small, perhaps 1,000 men, far too few to turn the tide of a losing war, and though he struck inland to storm the fortress of Carcun and burned what else he could reach, he took no great city and freed no holy place. Before long, a truce of 10 years was struck between the Christians of Acre and the Sultan, and the crusade that was meant to be his triumph quietly wound down into stalemate. Nor had he come alone. His wife, Eleanor of Castile, had crossed the sea at his side rather than wait out the years in England, and while the campaign faltered, she bore him a daughter within the walls of the Crusader city, a child the family would ever after call Joan of Acre. What Edward carried home from the east, then, was not a conquest. It was a growing household, a reputation for hardness and courage, and a wound. In June of 1272, in the dead heat of the Syrian summer, a man came to the prince's chamber claiming to carry secret messages, and was admitted, for he had come before and was thought a trusted go-between in Edward's dealings with the local emirs. This time he waited until the prince was alone and lightly clad against the heat, and then he struck, driving a dagger at him again and again. The blade had been steeped in poison. Edward, with the raw physical strength that would define him, closed with the man, wrestled him to the floor, and killed him where he lay, but not before the poisoned steel had bitten deep into his arm. The wound would not close. The flesh around it darkened and began to rot, and the surgeons, grave-faced, told him the corruption would have to be cut away if he wished to live. They carved the blackened tissue from his arm while he endured it, and slowly, against their expectations, he mended. Around that grim operation there later grew one of the most beloved stories in the whole English royal canon, that his wife, Eleanor of Castile, flung herself at his bedside and drew the venom from the wound with her own lips, saving his life at the hazard of hers. It is a tender image. The devoted queen made her husband's salvation, and it should be treated as exactly what it is, a later embroidery rather than a recorded fact. The earliest and soberest accounts credit the surgeon's knife, not the queen's mouth. One contemporary noted only that Eleanor was led weeping from the chamber so the physicians could do their brutal work in peace. Whether she played any part at all in his survival cannot now be known. What is certain is that Edward lived, and that his survival was swiftly dressed in the language of the miraculous, proof, men murmured, that God had spared him for some greater purpose. The prince who sailed for home carried a scar on his arm and, far more usefully, a legend, that he was a man marked by heaven and very hard to kill. He was in no hurry to reach that home even so. Word overtook him somewhere on the long road back through Sicily and Italy that his father was dead. Henry III, the pious, artistic, fatally irresolute king whose failures had shaped his son more surely than any tutor, had died in November of 1272, while his heir was still 1,000 miles away. In almost any other reign, the death of a king with the crown prince absent overseas would have been the signal for chaos, rival claimants stirring, barons arming, the throne going to whoever could reach it first. Instead, something remarkable happened. Nothing. The great men of England, the earls, the bishops, the barons who had so lately torn the kingdom apart in civil war, simply proclaimed the absent Edward king within days of his father's death, swore fealty to a man on the far side of Christendom, and kept his peace in his name. They did not wait for him to return. They did not wait for a coronation. They governed the realm on his behalf and left the throne standing empty until he chose to come and fill it. And Edward, secure in his grip as no English heir had ever been, took his unhurried time. He did homage to the French king for his lands across the Channel, settled the affairs of his Duchy of Gascony, quarrelled and hunted and rode in tournaments, and did not set foot in England until the late summer of 1274, nearly 2 years after he had become its king. That an entire kingdom should wait for him so long without a tremor was itself a kind of coronation. No English monarch had ever been so certain of his crown before he wore it. When at last he was crowned at Westminster in August of 1274, the man who knelt for the anointing was no longer the treacherous young Leopard of the Barons' War. The ceremony was a calculated magnificence, a fortnight of feasting on a scale meant to wash away every memory of the divided and humbled kingdom his father had left, with oxen and swine slaughtered by the hundred to fill the tables of the great. And among the princes who came to do him honor was Alexander, King of Scots, his own brother-in-law, the husband of his sister, a guest at the feast whose kingdom Edward would one day set himself to swallow whole. He was 35 years old, and he looked the part of a king as few men before or since have looked it. He was enormous, well over 6 feet tall, in an age when most men stood a head shorter, so that when his tomb was opened centuries later, his skeleton would measure a full 6 feet 2 inches. It was that long-boned frame that had already earned him the name by which history remembers him, Longshanks, the man with the long legs. He was broad and hard with it, a superb horseman, and a soldier who had never asked his men to bear anything he would not bear himself. His hair, dark in youth, had begun its slow turn toward the white that would one day give him the aspect of an Old Testament patriarch. And in his face sat one flaw that unsettled nearly everyone who met him. A left eyelid that drooped heavily, a defect inherited from his father, so that his stare in anger seemed hooded, half-veiled, and pitiless, the look, men said, of a soul being weighed and found wanting, for it was the anger that men remembered longest. Edward's rages were famous across Europe, and they were not the bluster of a weak man, but the eruptions of a very strong one, sudden, physical, and frightening. The household accounts of his reign, dry ledgers kept by clerks who cared for nothing but pounds and pence, preserve the odd startling glimpse between the columns of a temper that could turn violent in an instant, a payment set down, it was said, to make good some jewel or ornament the king had hurled from him in his fury. Such stories must be handled with care, for chroniclers loved a vivid tale and rarely let one go untended, but they are too many and too consistent to wave away. Men who served Edward faithfully for 30 years never quite stopped being afraid of him, and that fear was among the truest instruments of his rule. He returned to a kingdom that suited neither his temperament nor his ambition. His father had bequeathed him a tangle of half-enforced feudal rights, a treasury bled thin, and a patchwork of local powers that treated the king's writ as a matter for negotiation rather than obedience. Edward looked upon that disorder, the way he looked upon everything that stood in his path, as a problem to be mastered. He had no intention of being first among equals, the role his gentle father had drifted into and very nearly drowned in. He meant to be the single wellspring of authority in England, the fixed point around which every other power turned, and he had already begun to see how the law itself, patiently rewritten and mercilessly enforced, might be bent to serve that end. But the throne was only a beginning. Beyond it, to the west, the princes of Wales still held their mountain courts and dared to call themselves sovereign. Beyond them, to the north, the lords of Scotland spoke quietly of a kingdom that answered to no one. And nearer still, within the bounds of his own realm, lived a people whose wealth he had already learned to covet, and whose weakness he would in time exploit to a final and terrible conclusion. He surveyed all of it with the cold, appraising patience of a man who had learned at Evesham that terror worked, and who now held in his hands the entire machinery of a kingdom with which to apply it. England had never had a king who looked more like a king, and it had never had one who would prove so willing to use the full, cold machinery of the crown to get whatever he wanted. The kingdom Edward came home to master was, in truth, less a nation than a loose confederation of private powers. Justice was a commodity, bought and sold in the courts of local lords. The king's writ was in many places a suggestion rather than a command, and the crown's own lands and rights had been quietly nibbled away through the long, drifting years of his father's misrule. A lesser man might have made his peace with all of it and been content to preside, the first among many, over a realm he did not truly govern. But the man who had ordered the butchery at Evesham had no appetite for being an equal. He meant to be the master, and he understood, better than any English king before him, that the surest road to mastery was not the sword alone, it was the law. His first move was not to make law, but to find out exactly what he ruled. In the opening years of the reign he sent royal commissioners riding into every hundred and shire of England, armed with long lists of searching questions: what lands, rights, and revenues belonged to the crown, which of them had been quietly swallowed by the great men during the long disorders of his father's reign, and where the king's own sheriffs and bailiffs had abused their offices. The vast returns they carried back, the documents men came to call the 100 Rolls, amounted to a survey of the whole machinery of English government, the largest gathering of such knowledge the kingdom had seen since the Domesday Book 2 centuries before. It was entirely characteristic of the man. Before he reformed, he counted. Before he struck, he made certain he knew precisely where and at whom to aim. What followed across the next 2 decades has fair claim to be the most important program of lawmaking in English history, and it must be granted its due before anything darker is said of it. Edward was a king of ink and parchment as much as of blood and iron, blessed with an almost obsessive attention to detail and a legalist's genuine delight in the machinery of governance. In a torrent of great statutes, The 2 statutes of Westminster, the Statute of Gloucester, the Statute of Mortmain, the Statutes of Merchants, the Statute of Winchester, and more, he took the tangled, half-remembered customs of the realm and set them down in clear, enforceable, written law. These were not the tidings of a clerk. The first Statute of Westminster, issued in 1275, was a sweeping code touching every corner of English life, from the freedom of elections to the conduct of the courts. The Statute of Winchester, 10 years later, reorganized the keeping of the peace itself, requiring towns to watch their gates, ordering every man to keep arms according to his rank, and commanding that the highways be cleared of the thickets where robbers lay in wait. A measure so sound it stood on the books for more than 500 years. He turned his mind to trade as well. The statutes of merchants gave a creditor a swift and certain means of recovering an unpaid debt, registering bonds before officials so that a defaulter could be seized and his goods sold, and in doing so he made England a safer place to do business and its commerce a richer thing to tax. He reached deeper still into the very ownership of the land. The Statute of Mortmain checked the drift of estates into the dead hand of the Church, where they slipped forever beyond the reach of the Crown's feudal dues. The great Second Statute of Westminster reshaped the inheritance of property and the entailing of estates in ways that would govern English families for centuries. And through it all, Edward built something England had scarcely possessed before, a body of professional judges and lawyers, trained men who carried the king's justice on regular circuits into every shire, so that a subject in a distant county might expect from the royal courts a predictability, a rough consistency that had been unthinkable under Henry III. Later ages would call Edward the English Justinian, after the emperor who codified the law of Rome, and for once the flattering title was close to earned. Much of what he built outlived him not by years but by centuries, and some of it lives yet, nor was that the whole of it. He summoned to Westminster again and again the great assemblies that the age was learning to call parliaments, and in 1295, with war pressing on 3 frontiers at once, he called the greatest and most representative of them all, the gathering that a later age would name the Model Parliament. To it came not only the earls, the bishops and the abbots, but 2 knights from every shire and 2 burgesses from every borough, the lesser men of England summoned to speak for the communities that would have to bear the cost of what the king intended. The writ that called them borrowed a phrase from the old law of Rome, a principle that would echo down the whole future of English government, that what touches all should be approved by all. It is one of the founding moments of representative rule, and Edward's hand set it down, and yet, and here the light in the story begins to change. It would be a soft and sentimental error to read any of this as the work of a man in love with liberty. Edward did not build his parliament because he believed the common people had a right to be heard. He built it because he had run out of easier ways to reach their money. The same principle held for nearly all his lawmaking. Reform and control were, in his hands, very nearly the same act. Consider the proceedings men came to call quo warranto, Latin for by what warrant. Across the realm the king's justices descended upon the great lords and put to each a single, chilling question. By what right do you hold these lands, these liberties, these private courts and profitable jurisdictions? Produce the charter, show the paper. Where a lord could not, and many holdings were older than any parchment, the liberty could be clawed back into the hand of the crown. It was law wielded as a lever against the very men who had thought themselves the king's partners. The story was told, though it is likely too neat to be wholly true, that one great earl answered the king's justices by drawing an ancient rusted sword and declaring that his ancestors had won their lands with the blade, and that with the blade he would keep them. True or not, the tale caught a real and rising fear that Edward's law was quietly gathering every loose thread of power in England into his own fist, for that was the deeper purpose beneath the statutes and the summons. Edward saw the law not merely as a means to govern, but as a mechanism to consolidate, to draw every scattered authority in the kingdom inward toward a single center, until nothing of consequence happened in England that did not in the end answer to the crown. He professionalized the courts, and every gain in the efficiency of justice was also a tightening of the royal grip. He raised up a corps of clerks and officials of real talent, and that same disciplined bureaucracy existed above all to ensure that no penny of tax went uncollected and no act of defiance went unmarked. Under Edward, a man might indeed expect fairer, steadier treatment in the royal courts than his grandfather had known. and might also, in the same season, find himself sued by the crown for lands his family had held since before the paperwork existed. Both things were true. They were true because they came from the same design, and the design at its heart was built to pay for war. Edward's ambitions were ruinously expensive: the subjugation of Wales, the ringing of it in stone, the long reckoning he was preparing for Scotland, the defense of his lands in France. All of it devoured silver on a scale no English king had ever needed before. To feed it, he turned every instrument he had reshaped into an engine of revenue. He overhauled the coinage itself, calling in the whole of the realm's clipped and debased silver and striking it anew in a great recoinage that gave England sound money for the first time in living memory, an achievement admirable in itself and profitable to the crown besides. He fixed a permanent custom on the export of wool, the raw fleece that clothed the looms of Flanders and made England rich, so that a steady stream of silver flowed off the backs of the nation's sheep and into his treasury, and he borrowed against it on a scale no predecessor had dared, drawing vast sums from the Italian banking house of the Riccardi of Lucca, who advanced him ready money and collected the wool custom in return, a crown financed, in effect, by foreign bankers against the promise of English wool, and he summoned his parliaments above all to consent to the taxes that the wars required, for a tax granted by the assembled community of the realm was a tax that could be collected without revolt. He brought the knights and the burgesses to Westminster and gave them the dignity of being asked, and having asked them, he bound them to the answer and made them partners in the paying. The most celebrated institution of English liberty was, in its origin, a device for financing conquest. This is the paradox that must be held whole without letting either half fall away. Edward I was a genuine founder, a reformer perhaps unmatched among England's medieval kings, the maker of statutes and courts and a parliament that would shape the nation for 700 years and are rightly counted among its treasures. He was also, in the same breath and by the same means, forging the most formidable machine of royal power that had ever existed on the island. And he was doing it with a purpose that was neither gentle nor free. The clock he was building kept magnificent time. But a clock, however finely wrought, has no conscience and feels nothing of the weight of the hand that winds it. By the early 1290s, the work was very nearly done. The statutes were written, the courts were running, the parliament was tamed, and the treasury was fed, and the whole apparatus stood coiled and ready, waiting only for the king to point it. It was a feat of governance no ruler in Europe could rival, a kingdom that could be surveyed, taxed, judged, and moved as a single body at the will of one man. He was building the most sophisticated state in Europe, and he was building it, above all, to pay for conquest. The machine Edward had built at home was made to be pointed outward, and he pointed it first at Wales. To the modern eye the quarrel might seem small. Away in the mountains of the northwest, Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, the last native prince of Wales, had refused to come and kneel. He had won from Edward's own father a treaty recognizing his title and his primacy over the other Welsh lords, and he clung to that dignity now, declining year after year to perform the homage that would name him the English king's man. To Llywelyn it was the survival of a nation. To Edward it was intolerable defiance, an affront to the divine order of things, in which every lord on the island bowed in the end to the crown of England. He did not see the Welsh as a distinct people with an ancient right to their own hills. He saw rebels who had not yet been taught their place, and he set about teaching them with the same cold, grinding patience he brought to everything. The First War, in 1277, was not a war of dashing charges, but a masterpiece of logistics and remorseless method. Edward did not plunge into the trackless interior where Welsh ambush had swallowed English armies for generations. He advanced like a man building a road, because that is largely what he was doing, sending woodcutters ahead by the hundred to hew a broad, safe highway through the forests of the north so that his supplies and his heavy cavalry could follow the coast in security. And he understood the one truth that unlocked Gwynedd. Llywelyn's mountain fastness of Snowdonia could not feed itself. It depended on the grain of Anglesey, the flat and fertile island across the strait, the breadbasket of the north. So Edward sent a fleet, seized Anglesey, and set his men to reap the harvest that was meant to feed the Welsh through winter. He did not need to storm the mountains. He simply closed his hand around them and waited for hunger to do his work. By the Treaty of Aberconwy that autumn, Llywelyn was broken without a great battle ever being fought, stripped of his conquests, shorn of his overlordship, left clinging to a rump of Gwynedd and to the hollow shell of a title, a prince on sufferance, waiting for the day the English decided the pretence was no longer worth keeping. That day came in 1282, and it came from a quarter Edward had not expected. The rising began not with Llywelyn, but with his younger brother, Dyfed ap Gruffudd, a restless, treacherous man who had once betrayed Llywelyn and fought on the English side, and who had been rewarded for it, and who now found English lordship as galling as any Welshman did. On Palm Sunday, Dyfed fell upon the English castle at Hawarden and put its garrison to the sword, and the revolt he lit ran the length of the country in a matter of weeks. The grievances were real and deep. The swaggering contempt of English officials, the strange new courts, the taxes, the daily humiliations of a proud people governed by strangers. Llywelyn, whatever his private judgment of his brother, could not stand aside from a national rising, and he took up the cause that would kill him. This time Edward did not come to chastise, he came to finish. Where the first war had aimed only to bring Llywelyn to heel, the second was a war of conquest without disguise, and Edward waged it with the full weight of a kingdom he had spent a decade making rich. He summoned one of the largest armies England had ever put into the field, paid professional foot soldiers and crossbowmen by the thousand out of the treasury he had so carefully filled, and drew on the credit of his Italian bankers to keep them supplied through a winter campaign, for he meant, this time, not to withdraw when the snows came, but to press on until there was nothing left to press. He ground into Wales along the now familiar lines, the coast road hewn through the forests, the fleet standing off the shore, the seizure of Anglesey and its harvest, and he tightened his hold county by county, castle by castle, meaning to strangle the country as he had strangled it before, only now for good and all. But the Second War was not bloodless for the English, and it is worth remembering that the hammer did not fall without cost to the hand that swung it. Late in 1282, a force under Luke de Tanny threw a bridge of lashed boats across the Menai Strait from captured Anglesey to the mainland, and pushed across it, and were caught by the turning tide and a sudden Welsh onslaught. Men in heavy mail, cut off with the water rising behind them, went down by the score. Knights drowned in the strait in their armor, and the crossing became a disaster long remembered. For a moment the conquest wavered. It was steadied, as such things often are, by a single death. In December of 1282, Llywelyn had ridden south into the Middle March, drawn away from the safety of his mountains by the hope of raising the Marcher country behind the English lines, lured, some believed, into a trap laid by men who feigned friendship. Near Builth, separated from the bulk of his army at a river crossing men would remember as Orowin Bridge, he was caught and cut down in the confusion, by one account run through by an English man-at-arms, who did not learn until afterward, when the body was searched, whose life he had taken. The last true Prince of Wales died in a nameless scuffle in the winter mud, and with him died the cause, for there was no one left of his stature to gather the shattered nation behind. And Edward, who might have let the fallen prince keep in death the dignity of his rank, chose instead to make of his corpse a lesson. Llywelyn's head was struck from his body and sent to the king, and then on to London, where, so the chronicler's record, it was crowned in mockery with a wreath of ivy, in grim answer to an old Welsh prophecy that a prince of their blood would one day be crowned in the city, and set high upon the Tower of London for the crowds to jeer at as it rotted. The head of the dragon looked out over the Thames, and the message beneath it was plain. The line of the native princes was finished, but one branch of that line still lived, and Edward had not forgotten who had lit the fire. Dyfed, proclaiming himself prince over the wreckage of his brother's cause, fled into the high country and endured a fugitive winter in the mountains that had sheltered his family for centuries, hunted from refuge to refuge as the net drew tight. In June of 1283 he was betrayed by men of his own nation and delivered up to the king, and Edward, who in earlier years had extended to captured noblemen at least the outward courtesies of their rank, now resolved to make of this one an example the whole island would feel in its bones. Dyfed would not simply be killed, he would be unmade in public with a deliberate and inventive cruelty that would redraw the very meaning of treason. At Shrewsbury, in the autumn of 1283, Edward did something as calculated as the punishment itself. He had Dyfed condemned before a specially summoned parliament, so that the killing should carry not merely the king's will but the sanction of the whole assembled community of the realm. Treason made a matter of state, judged and sentenced in the open. And the sentence was without precedent in its completeness, each stage of the agony matched with grim precision to a separate crime. He was dragged to the scaffold at the tails of horses, his body broken on the stones of the town before the killing had even begun, as a traitor who had risen against his lord. He was hanged but cut down alive, still breathing, as a murderer for the blood spilled at Hawarden. His body was opened and his entrails drawn out and burned before him, while what remained of his awareness lasted, in penance it was said, for the sacrilege of shedding that blood in Holy Week. And at the last he was struck into 4 quarters as one who had plotted the death of the king. His head was sent to join his brothers above the tower, and the 4 pieces of him dispatched to be displayed in the corners of the kingdom, so that no part of him should rest and no town should forget. And the chroniclers record, with a horror all their own, that 2 English towns afterward quarrelled over which had the better right to a portion of the dead prince. It was, by many accounts, the first time in England that the full penalty men would come to know as hanging, drawing, and quartering was visited upon a victim in all its stages, and Dafydd was among the first, and by the reckoning of many the very first, to suffer it entire. Edward had not merely executed an enemy, he had fashioned a new instrument of terror out of a man's death agony, a ritual of state designed to turn punishment into theatre and to fix in the memory of every subject the precise and unbearable cost of defiance. Edward's care to end the line did not stop with the men. Llywelyn had left a single child, an infant daughter named Gwenllian, born that same year to a mother who had died in the bearing of her. Edward had the baby carried off to a remote priory in the flat English fenland of Lincolnshire, and there she was kept, a nun who had never chosen the veil for the whole of her long life. She died an old woman, having never once set eyes on the country she had been born to rule. Dafydd's young sons were shut up in Bristol Castle and never came out of it again. The house of Gwynedd was not merely beaten in the field, it was gathered up, child and all, and quietly snuffed out. With the princes dead and their line scattered in pieces across England, the old Wales simply ceased to be. Its laws would be swept aside, its lands carved into shires and handed to English sheriffs, its ancient courts silenced. Edward did not want merely to rule the country, he wanted to erase the very idea that it had ever been a country at all, until the memory of an independent Wales was bleached out of the soil like an old bloodstain, and to make that erasure permanent, to write it in something harder than parchment and heavier than any statute, he had already begun to summon the Masons. Wales was not defeated. It was extinguished as a nation, and Edward meant to make sure, in stone, that it could never rise again. A lesser conqueror would have counted Wales won and ridden home. Edward counted it only half finished. Killing the princes had ended a war, it had not ended a people, and Edward had learned long ago that a defeat which leaves the defeated their pride is a defeat that must one day be fought again. He did not intend to fight for Wales twice. So he set out to do something no English king had ever attempted on such a scale, to re-engineer the very landscape of Gwynedd, to plant upon the mountains and river mouths of the north a chain of fortresses so vast, so permanent, and so deliberately overwhelming that the Welsh would never again be able to imagine their country as their own. To build it, he summoned from the far side of Christendom the finest military architect of the age, a mason from Savoy known to history as James of St. George, who had raised castles for the counts of that alpine land and whom Edward valued so highly that he paid him a wage fit for a knight and set him over all the king's works in Wales. Together, king and builder, they raised the thing that would come to be called the Ring of Iron. It was a chain of the mightiest castles in Europe, and it rose in 2 great waves. The First War had already studded the borderlands with strongholds at Flint and Rhuddlan and beyond. But it was after 1283, with the princes dead and the country prostrate, that Edward and Master James built the wonders. At Conwy they threw a long high circuit of town walls, studded with a score of towers, down to the water's edge, and set a castle of 8 great drum towers hunched upon the rock at its end. At Harlech they perched a fortress on a sheer crag above the sea, and cut into the cliff a fortified stair running all the way down to the shore, so that ships could revictual the garrison even with the whole country in arms around it. And at Caernarfon they raised the mightiest and most deliberate statement of all. These were 3 of the most formidable fortifications the medieval world ever produced, thrown up with astonishing speed by armies of labourers, diggers, carpenters and masons. Later still, after one final Welsh rising, came Beaumaris on the flat of Anglesey, the most geometrically perfect castle of them all, its concentric rings of wall within wall, the pure distilled mathematics of domination. A masterpiece its own maker would never quite finish. We remember them now as romantic silhouettes against a grey sky, the pride of a nation's heritage, thronged in summer by visitors. They were not built to be beautiful, they were built to hold a conquered people down from the inside. The scale of the labor that raised them is difficult to grasp even now. In the building seasons, the works swallowed men by the thousand, diggers and hodmen, quarrymen and lime burners, carpenters and smiths, and the skilled masons who cut the dressed stone, pressed into service by royal writ, and marched to Wales from shires the length of England, some from as far off as the fenlands of the east and the moors of the southwest. They came under guard, for the land they came to build in was a hostile one, and they toiled through the short northern summers in numbers that stripped whole districts of their craftsmen. Timber was hauled from distant forests, stone shipped along the coast, iron and lead and rope brought in by the boatload. It was one of the greatest works of construction attempted anywhere in medieval Europe, and it was undertaken not to raise a cathedral to the glory of God, but to pin a conquered nation to the earth. That distinction is the whole truth of them. A castle set on a frontier faces outward, to keep an enemy from crossing in. Edward's castles did not face outward. They were planted in the heart of the subjected land, on its harbours and its river crossings, and they faced inward upon the Welsh themselves. They were garrisons of occupation, supplied by sea, so that no native rising could ever starve them out as Edward had starved out Llywelyn, each one a permanent iron fist closed around a stretch of country. And around the greatest of them, Edward did something more calculated still. He built towns. Beside Conwy, beside Caernarfon, beside the others, he laid out planned English boroughs, walled settlements peopled with English merchants and English families and shielded by the castle's guns. And from these new towns the Welsh were, by the very terms of their charters, shut out. A Welshman was forbidden to dwell within the walls, forbidden to trade in the markets, forbidden in many cases to carry so much as a blade within them. The conquered were made strangers in the shadow of their own former capital, barred from the prosperity built upon their defeat, held at the point of exclusion by the plain letter of English law. The castle was the sword, the borough was the settler's hearth planted behind it, and together they were a policy, the slow, deliberate colonization of a country whose own people were now to live on its margins. Nowhere was the arrogance of the design written larger than at Caernarfon. Edward did not want merely a strong castle there, he wanted a throne of empire, and he built one. The walls were not the ordinary grey stone of the other fortresses, but banded in courses of contrasting colour, and their towers were shaped not round but many-sided, in unmistakable echo of the great land walls of Constantinople, the imperial city of the Caesars, and the highest of them was crowned with carved stone eagles, the very standards of the Roman legions. The message was as deliberate as it was audacious. Beside the site had stood a Roman fort, and old Welsh legend wove the place into the story of the emperors, remembering one of them as Maxen Wledig, cast in their tales as an ancestral father of the princes of Wales. When, in the years the castle rose, workmen were said to have unearthed nearby a body that the age took for that of a Roman emperor of the old imperial line. Edward had the bones reburied with ceremony in the local church, quietly folding even the founding myth of the Welsh into his own pretension. He meant Caernarfon to declare that the King of England was heir to that imperial past, that his dominion over Wales was not conquest, but the restoration of a rightful and ancient order, and that the Welsh were now subjects within an empire as eternal as Rome itself. And to seal the claim in flesh, when his queen came to Caernarfon in 1284 and bore him a son within the rising walls, that boy, Edward of Caernarfon, became a living emblem of the new order, an English child born in the very citadel of the vanished Welsh princes. The cost of all this beggars easy description. Edward poured the wealth of a kingdom into the mortar of these walls, and it very nearly broke him. By the reckoning of modern historians, the works in Wales consumed a sum on the order of the crown's entire revenue for several years together, by some estimates well upward of £80,000 across the reign, at a time when the crown's ordinary income in a good year was only a fraction of that. It was a torrent of silver spent on stone, and it drove Edward to borrow from the bankers of Italy and to strain every source of income he had so carefully built. Harlech clung to its sea cliff and had to be supplied and paid for up a precipice. Beaumaris swallowed fortunes and was still unfinished when the money ran dry. Any other ruler might have flinched at the ledger. Edward did not blink. He was not buying castles, he was buying permanence, a fact on the ground so massive and so costly that no future king and no future rebellion could ever undo it. And what the stone declared, the law confirmed. In 1284, Edward set his seal to the Statute of Rhuddlan, the great settlement that formally annexed the principality to the English crown and remade its government in England's image. The old law of Wales, the intricate native code that had ordered Welsh society for centuries, was stripped away in its criminal parts and replaced with the king's. The land was carved into shires on the English pattern: Anglesey, Caernarfon, Merioneth, each with its sheriff and its officers answering to Westminster. What the castles did to the skyline, the statute did to the courts. Between them they left almost nothing of the old Wales standing except the mountains and the language. And yet the settlement was never quite so final as the stone pretended, as the Welsh themselves would prove. In 1294, with Edward's armies and his attention drawn away toward a fresh war in France, the country rose one last time under a distant kinsman of the fallen princes, Madog ap Llywelyn. The revolt spread with frightening speed. Caernarfon itself, the great imperial citadel, still half-built, was stormed and its unfinished defenses overrun, its new planted town put to the torch, and for a winter the whole machinery of conquest seemed to shudder. Edward turned back in a cold fury, marched into Wales through the snow, and ground the rising to nothing as he had ground down every other. But he had learned his lesson. The ring was not yet closed. And so he ordered the last of the great castles, Beaumaris, begun in 1295 on the shore of Anglesey, a flawless engine of wall within wall raised to make certain that the island, whose grain had always been the true key to Gwynedd, could never again slip from an English grasp. There is a chilling consistency in it, running straight back through everything Edward had ever done. At Evesham, he had not merely defeated Simon de Montfort, but dismembered him. In Wales, he did not merely conquer, but colonized statute and citadel, working together toward the same absolute end. He did not believe in the half measure, the negotiated settlement, the slow blending of peoples. He believed in total subordination, in making the periphery serve the center so completely that resistance became not merely dangerous, but unthinkable. And when he walked the battlements of Caernarfon and looked out over the smoke of the native villages rising from the valleys below, he had reason to believe he had achieved what no English king before him could, the reduction of a wild and defiant nation into a quiet, taxable, obedient province, ringed in iron and held down by stone. The castles still stand today, and we call them masterpieces. They were built to be a boot on a nation's neck. And then Edward turned to a darker project still at home. The darker project waiting at home was not a province to be pacified, but a people to be erased. Edward had spent his reign proving what he could do to those who defied him. Now he would show what he could do to those who had never defied him at all, a community that had lived under the protection of his crown for 2 centuries, and that he would, in a single decree, remove from England altogether. The Jews of England were, in the cold language of the age, servi camera regis, the serfs of the royal chamber, not subjects but possessions, the personal property of the king, to be taxed, mortgaged, and disposed of at his pleasure. Barred by the church from the guilds and by custom from holding land, they had been herded into the one trade left open to them, the lending of money at interest, and there they had become indispensable, the standing creditors of a kingdom perpetually short of ready coin, financing the very crown that owned them. For generations, that arrangement had made the Jews of England a source of wealth to be milked whenever the treasury ran dry. By Edward's day, it had been milked very nearly to death. That is the first hard truth of what followed, and it must be stated plainly. The community Edward would expel was not the prosperous target of legend. His father before him had squeezed it with tallage after crushing tallage until the great Jewish financiers were ruined and the ordinary families left poor. Edward continued the squeezing when he came to the throne until the wealth that had made the Jews useful was all but gone. What he did next, then, cannot even be excused as greed for a living asset. He turned upon a people his own house had already impoverished. The strangulation was made law in 1275 in the Statute of the Jury. It wore the appearance of moral reform, and it functioned as a sentence of ruin. At a stroke, it forbade the lending of money at interest, most the single livelihood the Jews had been permitted to practice, and offered them, in its place, the hollow promise that they might turn to trade or farming, in a realm where the guilds were closed to them and they could lease land only for a handful of years. In the same breath, the statute deepened their humiliation. Every Jew above the age of 7 was ordered to wear, fixed to the outer garment, a badge of yellow felt cut in the shape of the 2 tablets of the law, a mark that set its wearer apart in every street and made him a ready object of suspicion and contempt. They were pressed into designated quarters, watched and drained by levies that left even the once wealthy destitute. The king was not merely taxing a community now, he was dismantling it. Then came the killing. In the winters of 1278 and 1279, amid a sweeping crackdown on the clipping of the coinage, the shaving of silver from the edges of hand-struck coins, a crime committed across the realm by Christians and Jews alike, Edward ordered the arrest of the entire Jewish population of England. The prisons filled, and when the reckoning was done, the punishment fell with a terrible unevenness that tells its own story. Christians caught in the same offense were largely let off with fines, while the Jews were hanged in numbers. In London alone, by the counts that survive, around 269 Jews were put to death for the crime, and the property of the executed and the imprisoned flowed, as it always did, into the hands of the crown. The arrests served the treasury twice over. They removed men and seized their goods in a single motion. By the close of the 1280s, there was little left to take. The community was a husk, taxed into poverty, its leaders dead or fled, its usefulness spent. It no longer filled the king's coffers, and its continued presence served now only to trouble a populace that clergy and custom had long taught to regard the Jews as a people apart. That teaching had, over the generations, curdled into something darker still, the baseless and poisonous accusation that Jews murdered Christian children for their rights, a slander that had brought a number of the Jews of Lincoln to the gallows a generation earlier under Edward's own father. It was a fiction without a shred of truth in it, but it had already cost lives, and it had made the small, impoverished, badge-marked remnant an object of dread as much as of contempt. And so Edward reached the conclusion toward which every earlier cruelty had pointed. If they could no longer be milked, they could still be used one last time, not for their money, which was gone, but for the political gratitude their removal would earn. In July of 1290, he issued the Edict of Expulsion. Every Jew in England, without exception, was to be gone from the kingdom by the 1st of November, the Feast of All Saints. Those who remained after that day would forfeit their lives. It was the first time a European kingdom had moved to expel an entire people from within its borders, a total national banishment, cold and complete, with no exception made for the aged, the sick, the newborn, or the families who had known no other home for 200 years and spoke no tongue but English. They were permitted to carry away such movable goods as they could, and were promised the king's protection on the roads to the sea, but the substance of what they owned stayed behind. Their houses passed to the crown, their synagogues and their burial grounds were seized, and the debts still owed to them. The bonds that were the last of their wealth were not cancelled but confiscated, gathered in by a king who would now collect for himself from Christian debtors the very loans he had forbidden his Jews to make. The traffic in that debt had in truth been enriching the powerful for years. Even Edward's own queen, Eleanor of Castile, had quietly enlarged her estates by acquiring such bonds and taking the lands of debtors who could not pay, a practice for which the Archbishop of Canterbury had felt moved to reproach her. Now the crown swallowed the whole of it at a single stroke. Families who had lived in England for generations sold what they could not carry for whatever a panicked closing market would give, and made for the ports. The community being torn out by the roots was no recent arrival. It had lived in England since the days of the Conqueror, brought over from Normandy more than 2 centuries before, and in those 2 centuries it had put down deep roots. Synagogues in a dozen towns, schools and courts of its own law, burial grounds where generation lay upon generation, all of it was abandoned in a single autumn. The exiles crossed to France and to Flanders and scattered into the older Jewish quarters of the continent, carrying little beyond what their hands could hold into a Europe that was itself learning the same cruelty. Within a generation, the King of France would drive out his own Jews in turn, and the places of refuge would grow fewer still, but that lay in the future. In the closing weeks of 1290, the roads of England ran one way only, toward the sea and out. The king's promised protection proved worth very little. The chroniclers of the time record one episode that fixed the whole betrayal in a single image. A shipmaster took aboard a large company of Jewish passengers bound for the continent and worked his vessel down the Thames toward the open sea. At the river's mouth, as the tide fell, he ran his ship gently onto a sandbank and coaxed his passengers out onto the exposed flats to walk about while they waited for the water to turn. Then he climbed back aboard alone, and as the tide came in, he made sail and left them where they stood, and they drowned as the sea rose over the sand. The man was, in time, brought to account and hanged for it, but the story was remembered less for his punishment than for what it revealed: that a Jew in England in the autumn of 1290 had been placed in effect beyond the shelter of the law that governed everyone else. So the community that had endured in England since the conquest was gone, all of it, within months. As for how many were driven out, the honest answer is that we cannot be sure. By the counts that survive, some 2,000 to 3,000 souls, though older estimates run far higher, up towards 16,000. Whatever the true figure, the fact of it is not in doubt. There would be no openly professing Jews in England for very nearly 400 years. Not until the days of Oliver Cromwell in 1656 was the ban at last quietly allowed to lapse. Edward's decree stood for 3.5 centuries, and it achieved, in its own dark terms, precisely what he had intended. Presenting himself as the pious cleanser of a Christian kingdom, he won the warm approval of the Church and the barons and the commons, and in the same parliament that welcomed the expulsion, he was voted a 15th of the movable wealth of the whole realm, one of the largest grants of taxation of his entire reign. He had made himself the first king in Europe to erase a people from his realm, and the nation cheered him for it and gave him the taxes he had wanted all along. For all the hardness that ran through Edward's long reign, there was one place in his life the cold never seemed to reach. It was not a principle, and it was not a policy. It was a person. Her name was Eleanor of Castile, and she had come to him, at first, as a matter of business. In the autumn of 1254, when Edward was 15 and Eleanor perhaps 13, the two were married at the monastery of Las Huelgas in Burgos, in a match stitched together by their fathers to settle a quarrel over Gascony, the last great swathe of France still held by the English crown. Alfonso, King of Castile, had raised a claim to that wealthy duchy, and the neatest way to make the claim disappear was to bind his half-sister to the heir of England. It was the coldest kind of arrangement, the sort that welded two treasuries together and left the two children inside it to make of one another whatever they could. Such unions were expected to yield a lifetime of formal courtesy and separate beds, and little else. This one did not. What grew between them, against the whole grain of the age, was something close and lasting, and rarest of all in a king, faithful. For 36 years they were seldom apart. Where other monarchs left their queens behind in curtained apartments and took mistresses as an unremarked privilege of the crown, Edward carried Eleanor with him almost everywhere he went, on the endless progresses the length of England, into the wet mountains of Wales, while his armies ground down the last native princes, and even across the whole span of the Mediterranean on crusade, to the parched coast of the Holy Land, where a queen had no practical business at all, except that her husband did not care to be without her. She bore him, by the counts that survive, some 16 children across the years of their marriage. But the arithmetic of medieval childhood was pitiless, and many of those children were in the ground before they were grown. She traveled with his campaigns. She gave birth in his fortresses. Where Edward was, Eleanor was also. Some of those children came into the world in the strangest corners of his restless life. One daughter was born at Acre on the crusade in the Holy Land, and was called Joan of Acre ever after for the place of her birth. A son, the boy who would one day follow his father onto the throne, was born years later in the raw and half-built castle at Caernarfon, in the heart of a Wales only just hammered into submission. Eleanor's life in that sense was lived entirely inside her husband's, in his camps and his sieges and his conquests, following the drum of his ambition from Castile to Palestine and back again to the Welsh mountains, and bearing his heirs wherever the long road happened to have halted. She was no mere ornament at his side. Eleanor was clever, well-read, and formidable in her own right, a patron of books and of learning, at ease in the running of a great household, and, it must be plainly said, a hard and acquisitive woman of business. She built up a sprawling estate across England, often by buying up the debts that lesser landowners owed and pressing those debts until the land itself fell into her hands. And there were men among the gentry and the clergy who grumbled quietly that the Queen's agents were as grasping as any moneylender. She was not, in other words, a saint, and the record does her more honor by not pretending that she was. But to Edward, she was the one thing no one else in his world ever managed to be. She was constant. In a life organized around suspicion, around the managing of enemies and the weighing of advantage, she was the single fixed point he did not have to watch, the one person whose loyalty he never had to purchase or compel, and she was, so far as any record shows, the only woman he ever went to. For a medieval king, that bare fact is very nearly astonishing. Then, in the autumn of 1290, it ended. The king and queen had been making their way north together, toward a parliament and the first stirrings of the Scottish business, when Eleanor fell ill somewhere in the Midlands. A slow fever, the chroniclers suggest, of the kind that hung about the low, marshy country and would not lift. By late November, she could travel no further, and the royal party halted at the manor of Harby, a small place in Nottinghamshire not far from Lincoln. There, on the 28th of November, with Edward at her side, Eleanor of Castile died. She was about 49 years old, and she had been his wife for the whole of his adult life. What the king did next is the nearest thing to an open wound that Edward I ever allowed the world to see. He had her body embalmed and divided it, as was sometimes done for the very greatest, among 3 resting places, her viscera buried in the cathedral at Lincoln, her heart carried to the church of the Blackfriars in London, and her body borne in slow ceremonial stages down to Westminster Abbey to lie among the kings. That funeral journey took the better part of a fortnight, winding from Lincoln through the heart of his kingdom to the capital, and at every place where the bier rested for the night, Edward commanded that a great stone cross be raised so that the road itself would remember where the Queen had lain. 12 crosses in all went up over the years that followed, from Lincoln and Grantham and Stamford, down through Northampton and Dunstable and St Albans, to the little village of Charing on the western edge of London, within sight of the Abbey. These were no rough waymarkers. They were tall, intricate monuments of carved stone, crowned with statues of the dead queen, wrought by the finest masons in England at staggering cost, and the last and most splendid of them, at Charing, gave its name to a corner of London that carries it to this day. 3 of those 12 still stand, at Geddington, at Hardingstone beside Northampton, and at Waltham. The rest were broken up in later and harder centuries, and the Charing Cross that travellers hurry past now is only a Victorian copy, raised close to the spot where the vanished original once stood. The grief they were built to hold has outlasted most of the stone. Over her tomb at Westminster he set a gilded effigy of bronze, and he endowed candles to burn and masses to be sung for her soul, which he would go on paying for, faithfully, year after year, for the rest of his life. Historians have long argued over what all this stone and gold truly meant. Was it grief, or was it a king who could not help turning even his sorrow into a display of power, a man so wholly at home in symbols that he could mourn only in monuments? The honest answer with Edward is almost certainly both. He did nothing on a small scale, and he had never learned to be private about anything. His love, like his cruelty, had to be built where the whole realm could see it. Yet the sheer scale of it, and the sheer length of it, the masses still being said for her a decade and more after she was gone, are not the marks of a man performing an emotion he does not feel. Whatever else the Eleanor crosses were, they were the grief of a man who did not grieve easily, made permanent in the only language he trusted. And there was a colder truth folded inside the loss, one his contemporaries seem to have grasped almost at once. Eleanor had been more than a wife. She had been the one human being withstanding enough and nearness enough to reach him, to soften a judgment, to beg off a punishment, to stand for a moment between the king's temper and its object. It was the traditional office of a queen to intercede, to kneel and ask mercy so that the king might grant it without seeming weak. And time and again in the records, Eleanor appears in exactly that part, the quiet hand on the sleeve, the voice that asked and was, now and then, actually heard. With her gone, that voice was gone. It was said, in her own time and long after, that the Queen had been the last softness left in him, and that when she died, some door in Edward closed and did not open again. He was past 50 now, and for the first time in his life he stood entirely alone at the summit of his own power. The father whose weakness he had spent a lifetime refusing to repeat was long dead. The one companion of his heart lay under her bronze effigy at Westminster. What remained to him was the apparatus he had spent that lifetime building, the statutes, the castles, the armies, the machinery of a state stronger than any English king had ever commanded, and not one person left with the standing to tell him no. Only months before she died, that very year, he had already done the deed that would blacken his name the longest, driving every Jew out of England by the stroke of a pen. Now, with the one restraint upon his nature laid in the ground, he turned his cold and undivided attention to the north, where a throne had lately fallen empty and a frightened kingdom was about to make the most fatal mistake in its history and ask him to help. With Eleanor gone, the coldness in him had nothing left to warm it, and the hardest years of his reign and his cruelest were still to come. Grief did not hold him long. Within a year of laying Eleanor in the ground, Edward's whole attention had swung north, to a kingdom that had just suffered a catastrophe of its own, and to an opportunity that must have looked to him very much like a gift. For in the autumn of 1290, Scotland found itself a country with no one left to crown. Its king, Alexander III, had died 6 years before, thrown from his horse in the dark along a cliff road on a foul night, leaving no living child. The entire hope of the ancient royal line had come to rest upon a single small head, his granddaughter Margaret, a girl of 7 known as the Maid of Norway, the child of the Norwegian king, who had never once set eyes on the country she was born to rule. And by a stroke of the coldest good fortune, Edward had already arranged for that hope to serve his own ends. By the Treaty of Berwick, sealed only that year, the little queen was betrothed to his own son and heir, Edward of Caernarfon, a marriage that would in time have folded the Scottish crown quietly and lawfully into the English one, with never a blow struck. Then, on the sea crossing from Norway to her kingdom, somewhere in the grey waters off Orkney, the maid sickened and died. With her died the last direct thread of the royal house of Scotland, and the marriage that would have won Edward everything for nothing. What remained was a dangerous scramble for an empty throne. No fewer than 13 men came forward in time to claim it, but 2 overshadowed all the rest: John Balliol, Lord of Galloway, and Robert Bruce, Lord of Annandale, grandfather of the Robert Bruce who would one day be king, each backed by a powerful web of kindred and allies, each certain of his right, and each entirely capable of dragging the country into civil war to make that right good. The men who governed Scotland in the interval, the guardians of the realm, looked at the 2 armed camps hardening around the 2 great claimants and saw that war coming. For 2 anxious years they had held the kingdom together in the name of a dead king's memory and an absent child's right. Now the child too was dead, and the fragile peace they had kept was about to break apart in their hands. And so they made a decision that seemed at the time both prudent and even flattering, and proved in the end to be the most ruinous in their nation's history. They reached for the one man in the island with the prestige, the power, and the towering reputation for law to stand above the quarrel and settle it. They reached for the King of England. There was reason, on the surface of things, to trust him. Only the year before, in the very treaty that had betrothed the little Maid of Norway to his son, Edward had solemnly guaranteed that Scotland should remain separate and free, sovereign in her own laws and customs, and that no Scot should ever be compelled to answer for anything in a court beyond the borders of the realm. The promise was fresh, the ink was scarcely dry. It would be worth remembering, in the bitter months to come, exactly how much such a promise weighed in the scale against Edward's advantage, which was to say, nothing at all. It was, on its face, the highest possible compliment to Edward, an acknowledgment that he was the supreme lawgiver of his age, the natural arbiter of Christendom's hardest question of inheritance. It was also the opening he had wanted for years. For Edward did not come to the great cause, as the succession dispute came to be called, in the spirit of a disinterested judge. He came in the spirit of a king who had long regarded his own law as the sharpest weapon in his armory, and who now saw a whole kingdom hand him the hilt. He accepted the office of arbiter with grave and lawyerly courtesy, and then, before he would consent to hear a single argument, he named his price. In the spring of 1291 he summoned the claimants and the guardians to Norham, a castle on the English bank of the River Tweed, and there, hemmed about by his judges and his men-at-arms, he informed the assembled Scots that he would preside over their great cause not as an obliging neighbour, but as their feudal overlord, the Lord Paramount of Scotland, and that no man's claim would be so much as considered until he had first acknowledged that superior lordship. It was a demand dressed in the sober robes of legal antiquarianism, propped up by a mountain of old chronicles his clerks had combed for precedent, and it caught the Scots precisely where they were weakest. To refuse was to send the King of England and his army home as a declared enemy, with the throne still empty and civil war still waiting. To agree was to concede, in a single afternoon, the independent sovereignty of the kingdom, and the claimants, each of them wanting the crown far too badly to be the man who wrecked the process, submitted. One after another they knelt and acknowledged Edward as their overlord. Before the hearing had properly begun, he had already taken the thing he most desired, and he had taken it not with the sword, but with a signature, and there was more. As Lord Paramount, Edward required that the kingdom itself, together with its royal castles, be delivered into his keeping for the whole duration of the process, to be restored, he promised, to whichever man he should in the end declare the rightful king. And so it was that before a single genealogy had been unrolled and argued, the strongholds of Scotland stood garrisoned in Edward's name, and the guardians who had invited him to sit as their judge discovered that they had, in every way that mattered, invited him to occupy. The hearing that followed was vast, meticulous, and, in its own way, genuinely magnificent. The largest question of inheritance ever tried in that world, argued before a court of more than 100 auditors, a great bench of them named by Balliol, an equal number named by Bruce, and a solid block named by Edward himself, so that the King of England quietly held the balance of the very tribunal appointed to weigh the first great test of his overlordship. He heard the rival genealogies unrolled at exhausting length. He let learned men dispute the finer points of succession for the better part of 18 months. He presided over all of it with the patience of a man who has all the time he needs. And when at last, in November of 1292, he gave his judgment in the great hall at Berwick, it went to John Balliol, as, in strict law, it very likely should have. Balliol was descended from the eldest daughter of the old royal stock, and by the ordinary rules of primogeniture that governed every noble inheritance in Christendom, the senior line came first. The verdict was defensible. It may well have been the correct one. But Edward had not laboured over the great cause out of reverence for Scottish law, and it did not escape the notice of the watching lords that the man the law delivered into his hands was also the more cautious, the more anxious, and the more pliable of the two great claimants, a lord far more likely, once crowned, to remember whose judgment had set the crown upon his head. Edward had the law he wanted and the king he wanted, and by a happy chance they were the same man. What John Balliol did not yet grasp was that he had not been handed a throne. He had been handed a leash. He was crowned at Scone in the ancient manner, seated upon the sacred stone of his forefathers, and the coronation was very nearly the last free act of his kingship. For Edward set about at once demonstrating what his overlordship meant in the flesh, and he did it through the instrument he loved best, the law. Scotsmen dissatisfied with the rulings of their own king's courts were now invited, even encouraged, to appeal over Balliol's head to the King of England at Westminster, and Edward heard those appeals with unconcealed relish. When a Scottish lord named Macduff brought just such a complaint, Balliol was summoned south to answer for it in his own person, made to stand before the English Parliament, not as a brother sovereign, but as a defendant, a tenant hauled in to give account to his landlord. Once, and only once, Balliol tried to stand upon his dignity, sending word that a king could not answer such a suit without the counsel of the community of his realm. Edward's court found him in contempt for the refusal, and coolly ordered 3 of his chief castles and towns forfeit until he should learn better manners. He learned them. He came, and he answered, and he explained, and he apologized, and he submitted. Each summons was a small public stripping of his dignity, staged where the envoys of half of Europe could watch a king of Scots humbled like a delinquent bailiff. It was calculated, and it was tireless, and it was meant to hammer one lesson home until no one on either side of the border could mistake it, that there was but one true sovereign in the island of Britain, and he held his court at Westminster. The final indignity came wrapped, as such things so often did with Edward, in the language of duty. In 1294 he went to war with the King of France over Gascony, and he called upon Scotland, as any faithful vassal must answer the summons of its lord, to furnish men and money, and to send its greatest magnates in person to fight in a French quarrel that was no concern of theirs. It was one demand too many. To be bled for the very crown that was busy strangling them was more than even a cowed nobility could swallow, and something in the Scottish body politic finally set hard. The magnates moved to take the governing of the kingdom out of their broken king's hands, binding him about with a council of the realm, and began, cautiously, to cast about abroad for a friend against the overlord who had made himself their master. Edward had asked to be a judge, and the Scots had let him be one, and step by patient, lawful step, he had made himself something else entirely. He had been asked to be a judge, and he had made himself a master, and when Scotland finally refused him, he showed it exactly what his mastery meant. Edward had broken Wales with stone and patience, ringing its mountains with castles until a whole nation simply ran out of ground on which to resist. He had come, by 1296, to believe that conquest was a kind of formula. Take the king, take the strongholds, take the head of whoever leads, and a people will subside in time into the silence of subjects. He carried that formula north with him now, certain that Scotland was only one more stubborn province waiting to be taught its place. He would be proven right in every particular but the one that mattered. The break, when it came from a Scotland that had at last found the nerve to defy him. Pushed past all endurance by his demand that they bleed for his French war, the Scottish magnates had wrested the government of their kingdom from the trembling hands of John Balliol and taken a step of open defiance. In October of 1295 they sealed a treaty with Philip of France, Edward's own enemy, each realm pledging to come to the other's aid against the King of England. It was the beginning of what later ages would call the Auld Alliance, the long friendship between Scotland and France, forged in shared dread of the power to the south, and to Edward it was an act of naked treachery, vassals conspiring with his enemy against their lord. Early in 1296, the Scots went further still and formally renounced the homage they had sworn him, and a Scottish force crossed the border to raid into the north of England, burning villages and sparing little in their path. For savagery on that border was never the property of one side alone. For Edward, it was all the invitation he required. The judge laid aside his robes. The soldier put on his mail. He came north that march at the head of a great army and halted before the walls of Berwick upon Tweed. Berwick was then the richest town in all Scotland, a crowded and prosperous port through which passed much of the kingdom's trade with the wider world, a place thick with merchants and warehouses and Flemish traders. It was wealth without walls worth the name, for its defences were little more than a timber palisade and an earthen ditch. And when the town, trusting perhaps to its own importance and not truly believing that he would fall upon it, refused to open its gates, Edward stormed it. What followed was the thing that would be remembered of him in Scotland for 600 years. The sack was without mercy. Edward's soldiers poured through the flimsy defences and fell upon the town, and for the better part of 2 days they killed without restraint. Not only the men who had stood against them, but, by every account that survives, the townspeople wholesale, cut down in the streets and dragged out of their houses. A company of Flemish merchants held their trading hall, the Red Hall it was called, and fought on from within it to the last man rather than surrender, until the English fired the building over their heads and burned them alive inside it. How many died in the town altogether no honest man can say. The chroniclers reach for enormous figures, some naming 7,000, some many times that, one insisting the dead ran to the tens of thousands, and their numbers are not to be trusted, for medieval writers counted the slain much as they counted armies, in vast round figures meant to convey the scale of a horror rather than its arithmetic. But the numbers hardly matter to the truth of the thing. The slaughter at Berwick was severe and deliberate, and long remembered. A thriving town was gutted in an afternoon, and its people butchered, and the memory of it would harden Scottish hearts against Edward for generations yet unborn. He had wanted a warning written in blood at the very gateway of the kingdom, something to freeze the resistance out of every town that lay beyond. He got one, but terror, he had yet to learn, is a blade that cuts both ways. When the killing was at last called off, and the chronicles say it was Edward himself who halted it at the sight of a woman struck down in the very act of giving birth, he did not withdraw. He stayed. He set his soldiers and the shocked survivors alike to labor, digging a great new ditch and raising fresh ramparts, for he meant to keep Berwick and to remake it as an English town, the northern capital of his new dominion. The richest port in Scotland would trade from that day forward for the profit of the very crown that had butchered it. The battle, when it came, was almost an afterthought. A month later, in April, the feudal host of Scotland, the mounted array of the whole kingdom, met an English force at Dunbar and was scattered in a single brief and humiliating clash. Watching the English cavalry wheel and shift across the broken ground, the Scots took the maneuver for flight, broke their own ranks to give chase, and were caught strung out in the open and ridden down. The flower of the Scottish nobility was taken prisoner in the course of a single afternoon and carried off to the jails of England, and the war was as good as decided before it had properly begun. With that, organized resistance simply fell apart. Edward marched the length of Scotland all but unopposed, and the great castles opened to him one after another, Roxburgh, Edinburgh, Stirling, their garrisons yielding, some of them without so much as a fight. He rode on almost to the far north, as far as Elgin in Moray, and scarcely a spear was raised against him the whole way, so that he planted his writ and his garrisons across the country as a man might stroll through his own estate. In the space of a single summer's campaign, an ancient kingdom had folded. At Montrose, in July, he came for the king he had himself made. John Balliol, the cautious man raised up 4 years earlier to be a comfortable puppet and goaded at the last into a defiance he had never had the stomach for, was brought before his overlord to be unmade. In a ceremony devised for the greatest possible humiliation, the royal arms of Scotland were publicly torn from his tabard, the surcoat stripped of its heraldry before the watching court, and the broken king was led away into captivity in England and then exile abroad. The Scots gave him a name that outlived every other thing about him: Tum Tabard, the empty coat, a king with the kingship ripped out of him. Edward, it was reported, remarked with the contempt of a man tossing aside a worn-out tool that one does good work who rids himself of filth. Whether he truly said such a thing cannot now be proved, but it caught his feeling exactly. Deposing a king, however, was not enough for him. Edward meant to carry off the very idea of Scottish kingship, and so he went to Scone, the ancient place where the kings of Scots had been made kings out of the deep reaches of memory, and he took the stone. The Stone of Scone was a plain, weathered block of sandstone, unremarkable to any eye that did not know it, and to the Scots it was beyond price, the seat upon which their monarchs had been inaugurated, time out of mind, the very heart of their sovereignty made solid. Edward had it prized from its place and hauled south to Westminster, where he ordered it enclosed within a great wooden throne, a coronation chair, so that every future king of England would be crowned seated quite literally atop the captured kingship of the Scots. It was a stroke of symbolism entirely his own, permanent, public, and cruel in its exactness. He stripped away the Scottish regalia besides, the crown jewels of the realm, and the black rood of Scotland, a holy fragment of the true cross that had belonged to the sainted Queen Margaret and was reckoned the most sacred relic in the land, and he carted off a great mass of the kingdom's muniments and records, the very written memory of its statehood, to be locked away in England. He was not merely defeating Scotland, he was attempting, article by article, to abolish it. And then, holy in character, he turned his conquest into paperwork. That August, at a parliament held amid the ruins of Berwick, Edward compelled the landholders of Scotland, earls and barons, bishops and burgesses, some 2,000 of them in all, to come before him, swear their fealty, and set their seals to written deeds of homage that named him their king. These documents, gathered onto long rolls of parchment heavy with their hundreds of dangling wax seals, became known as the Ragman Rolls, and they were the perfect expression of the lawyer king's mind. He did not merely conquer Scotland, he made Scotland sign for it, converting the subjugation of a nation into an orderly archive of its own consent. When it was done, he set English officials over the country to govern it in his name, the Earl of Surrey as its keeper, and a hard, grasping treasurer named Hugh de Cressingham to wring revenue out of it, garrisoned its castles with English troops, and turned for home, well satisfied that the Scottish question had at last been closed for good. He would come to know both those names again and the country that hated them sooner than he thought. He believed the matter closed. In a single savage season he had crushed the Scottish army, sacked the wealthiest town in the kingdom, deposed and humiliated its king, stolen the sacred stone of its coronations, and gathered the sealed submission of its entire ruling class. By every measure he understood, Scotland was finished, conquered as thoroughly as Wales, reduced from a kingdom to a province on the growing map of his dominion. He had applied the formula, and the formula had worked. What he could not see, riding south in the late summer of 1296, was that he had made a mistake of a kind no formula of his could reckon with. He had stripped Scotland of its king, its army, its nobles' oaths, and its holy relics, of everything, in short, that a man might bargain over or surrender. He had left its ordinary people with nothing to lose and a fresh and burning grievance, and people in that condition do not sue for terms. Edward believed he had finished Scotland forever. He had, in fact, created the very thing that would haunt the rest of his life, a nation with nothing left to lose. The conquered kingdom did not stay quiet even a year. The peace Edward carried home from Scotland in 1296 was the peace of shock, not of submission, and beneath it the country he thought he had finished was already beginning to burn. The rising, when it came in the summer of 1297, did not begin among the great earls. They had set their seals to the Ragman Rolls, they had lands and titles and skins to protect, and could generally be relied upon, in the end, to make terms. It began lower down, among lesser men with far less to lose, and it threw up a leader from very nearly nowhere, a younger son of a minor knightly family, a man of no great estate and no seat at any council table, named William Wallace. History knows less of his origins than legend would like. The chronicles that later scrambled to explain his sudden rise could agree on little except that he was a big man, unusually tall and powerful, and that he hated the occupation with a cold and violent purity. The spark, by the traditional account, was blood. Wallace killed the English sheriff of Lanark, a man named Heselrig, in the early summer of 1297. Some later said in revenge for the killing of a woman dear to him, though that belongs more to story than to the record. And having put himself beyond any hope of pardon, he made himself the center of a swelling revolt in the south. In the north, at the very same time, a young lord named Andrew Moray raised the country beyond the Forth with an equal fury. The two risings found each other and merged, and by the end of that summer, Wallace and Moray together commanded the thing the great nobles had never dared to field, an army of the common people of Scotland, in open arms against the King of England. Edward, as it fell out, was overseas, wrangling with the French and with his own rebellious barons over the taxes for his wars, and the task of stamping out the rising fell to the men he had left to govern Scotland, the Earl of Surrey, his lieutenant, and Hugh de Cressingham, his treasurer there, a fat and grasping official whom the Scots loathed with a particular venom. In September of 1297, the two led an English army to Stirling, where the road north crossed the River Forth by a long and narrow wooden bridge, and there they made a catastrophic mistake. Wallace and Moray held the high ground beyond the water and watched the English begin to file across the bridge, a crossing so narrow that scarcely 2 horsemen could ride it abreast. They did not strike at once. They waited, with terrible patience, until enough of the English had crossed to be worth the killing, but too few to prevail, until the vanguard stood committed on the wrong bank with the river at its back and the bridge choked solid behind it, and only then did they come down off the hill and fall upon them. The trapped English could not form their ranks, could not maneuver, could not retreat. The bridge behind them jammed with struggling men, and by some accounts gave way. What happened on the north bank was less a battle than a butchery. The vanguard was destroyed almost to the last man, while the greater part of the army watched, helpless, from the far side of a river they could not cross. Cressingham the treasurer was among the dead, and here the record slides toward horror. It was said that the Scots flayed his corpse, and that Wallace had a strip of the hated tacksman's skin dressed into a belt for his sword. The chroniclers who tell it were no friends of Wallace, and the tale may well have grown in the telling, but that it was told at all is a measure of the hatred the occupation had bred. Stirling Bridge made Wallace. He was knighted and named Guardian of Scotland to govern in the name of the exiled Balliol, a landless younger son lifted by sheer force of will to the rule of a kingdom. Through the winter that followed, he carried the war south, harrying Northumberland and Cumberland. For one improbable season, the thing that could not happen had happened. Edward's conquest lay in ruins, and a commoner ruled Scotland in open defiance of him. It could not last, and Edward saw to it that it did not. He came home, made a grudging peace with France, patched up the quarrel with his barons, and turned the whole weight of his kingdom northward. In the summer of 1298, he led one of the largest armies of his entire reign into Scotland to hunt Wallace down, and at Falkirk in July he ran him to earth at last. Wallace drew up his spearmen in schiltrons, vast rings of men, 100 strong, each presenting a bristling hedge of long spears in every direction, a formation that could bring a cavalry charge to a dead and bloody halt. Against mounted knights alone, they might have held the field all day. But Edward had learned something in his Welsh wars, and he had brought it north with him, the massed archer. Rank upon rank of bowmen loosed into the packed Scottish rings, and the schiltrons, unable to close with their tormentors, unable to break and run, stood where they were and were shot to pieces, the arrows tearing gaps into which the English knights then rode to finish the work. It was a foretaste of the way the longbow would one day make English armies the terror of Europe, and at Falkirk it shattered the Scottish foot utterly. Wallace's army was destroyed. Wallace himself escaped the field, but the aura of invincibility that had clung to him since Stirling Bridge was gone, and his brief command of the kingdom went with it. He gave up the guardianship not long after. This is the Wallace the modern world believes it knows, largely through a single celebrated film, and it is worth pausing, just once, to set the man apart from the myth. The real Wallace needed no invention to make him formidable, yet a great deal was invented around him all the same. The blue war paint the film painted on his face belonged to naked tribesmen 1,000 years before his time. The belted plaids his men wore were centuries too early for the field of Falkirk. The notorious ride of a lord to a bride's first night, the so-called prima nocte said to have driven him to rebel, appears nowhere in the record of Edward's Scotland. And the love affair the film gave him with a French princess is pure chronological fantasy. She was an infant in Paris throughout his career and did not set foot in England until years after both he and Edward were dead. The truth required none of it. For what Edward did to the living, Wallace was worse than anything a film would dare to invent. After Falkirk, Wallace vanished into the life of a hunted man. He surrendered the guardianship to others and for a time left Scotland altogether, travelling to the court of France and perhaps to the Pope himself to plead his country's cause, while at home lesser men carried on the war and one by one made their peace with Edward. He came back to a Scotland where the resistance was crumbling and where he himself had become less a general than a symbol, and a symbol was the one thing Edward wanted above all else to destroy. For 7 years the king hunted him with a patience that never once flagged, pressing and bribing the Scottish nobility to give him up, until in August of 1305 Wallace was taken at last near Glasgow, betrayed into English hands by a Scot in Edward's own service, a knight named Sir John de Menteith. They bound him and rode him south to London. What waited for him there was not a trial in any sense he would have recognized, but a piece of theatre with its ending already written. He was brought into Westminster Hall on the 23rd of August and set upon a bench where the crowd could see him, and there, in mockery of the rumour that he had wished to make himself a king, they placed upon his head a crown of laurel. The charge was treason, that he had made war upon his lawful sovereign, slain his officers, and laid waste his lands. And to the charge of treason, Wallace is said to have made the one answer that cut clean to the heart of the whole affair, that he could not be a traitor to Edward, for Edward was not his king, and he had never once sworn the man his fealty. It was unanswerable. It did not matter. No defense was allowed, and no verdict was ever in doubt. The purpose of the day was not to weigh his guilt, but to stage his end. That end was the most terrible the age could contrive, and Edward had already refined it into a science upon the bodies of the Welsh. Wallace was stripped and lashed to a hurdle and dragged behind horses through the streets of London, some 4 miles of them from Westminster to the Elms at Smithfield, with the crowds pressed thick along the way. There he was hanged, and then cut down alive, still breathing before the rope could kill him. He was castrated and disembowelled, his entrails drawn out of his living body and burned in a fire before his own eyes, the whole grim art of the thing lying in keeping the condemned man conscious for as much of it as could be managed. Only then was he beheaded and his body hacked into 4 quarters. It was the full penalty for treason, as Edward had shaped it, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. And it was visited upon a man who had told them truthfully that he owed their king nothing at all. The pieces of him were sent out across the island as a public lesson. His tarred head was fixed upon a pike above London Bridge, the first of the many that would look down from that place in the grim centuries to come. His 4 quarters were dispatched to the north, to be nailed up at Newcastle, at Berwick, at Stirling, and at Perth, displayed in the towns of the very country he had fought for, so that no Scot might travel far without meeting some fragment of what defiance had cost. It was meant to be the end of the whole matter, the final and unanswerable word. Edward had made Wallace suffer as no enemy had suffered before, and scattered his body across the island as a warning. The warning did not work. A new enemy was already reaching for the crown. The warning had been written across the whole island in a dead man's flesh. William Wallace's head looked down from London Bridge. His quartered body was nailed up in the northern towns, and the lesson the king intended was that defiance ended in ruin, publicly and without appeal. It should have been the crowning proof of Edward's mastery in his old age. Instead, it marked the beginning of a slow unraveling, for the king who had scattered Wallace across Britain was himself beginning to come apart, and the terror he had spent a lifetime aiming outward was turning now, in his final years, into something smaller, meaner, and closer to home. He was old, and he knew it. Born in the summer of 1239, Edward had passed his 67th year, an age few men of his century reached, and fewer kings. The giant frame that had carried him from the sands of Palestine to the bogs of Snowdonia, that had made him stand a full head above other men, was failing him at last. The dysentery that would in the end kill him had begun its slow and humiliating work, and there were days when the man who had spent half his life in the saddle could not sit a horse at all. He, who had built his entire idea of himself on strength, was being betrayed by his own body, and that betrayal did nothing to gentle him. The temper did not fade as he weakened, it curdled. That sudden, volcanic rage, which men who had served him for 40 years had never stopped fearing, grew erratic and suspicious in his last years, and it fell hardest on those who could not flee it. His servants, his ministers, and his own children. The evidence survives, oddly enough, in the least dramatic of all documents. The royal household accounts, the dry, patient ledgers that recorded every candle and cask, every wage and every mend, set down, without comment, the price of the king's temper. Among the entries is a payment to a goldsmith for the repair of a great jewel the king had flung in a fit of rage. Elsewhere, the cost of mending a coronet he had hurled into a fire. The clerks did not editorialize. They noted the damage and settled the bill, and in doing so they preserved, better than any chronicle, the atmosphere of that court in its last years, a place where precious things were smashed when the old man's fury rose, and someone came quietly afterward to sweep up the fragments and pay for the repair. The more lurid stories that gathered around him must be held more lightly, for they cannot be proved. It was said, the story goes, though no ledger confirms it, that in one of his rages he set upon his daughter Elizabeth and tore handfuls of hair from her head. Whether it happened exactly so or grew in the retelling is beyond recovering, but the fact that men believed it of him is itself a kind of evidence. This was a king of whom such a thing could be believed. The burning coronet, some said, had been hers as well, flung into the flames during a quarrel over her marriage, and there the ledger and the legend touch, the account book recording, in its bloodless hand, the mending of a thing the king had destroyed in anger at his own child. But it was not his daughters who truly haunted him, it was his son. Edward of Caernarfon, the first English heir to carry the title Prince of Wales, was, to his father's eye, everything a king should not be. Where the old man was iron, the young one seemed soft. He preferred the company of grooms and ditchers, oarsmen and players to the hard schooling of arms. He showed little appetite for the joyless, grinding labor of rule that had swallowed every year of his father's life, and he had attached himself with a devotion that unsettled the whole court to a young Gascon knight named Piers Gaveston. To the king, Gaveston was more than an unsuitable friend. He was a symptom, living proof that the boy who would one day inherit the strongest crown in Europe lacked the hardness to keep it, and hardness was the whole of Edward's creed. He had built his life in flight from a single memory. His own father, Henry III, pious, generous, artistic, and weak, who had lost the loyalty of his barons, squandered his treasure on schemes that came to nothing, and very nearly forfeited his throne. Edward had watched that humiliation as a boy, and sworn he would never repeat it. Now, in his heir, he thought he saw it returning, the same softness, the same fatal preference for favorites over the cold business of power, rising again in his own blood. It was the thing he feared most in the world, and it wore his son's face. The rupture, when it came, was bitter and public. Already, in 1305, the prince had quarrelled violently with Walter Langton, the king's treasurer and most trusted minister, and Edward had sided without hesitation with his servant against his son. He banished the young man from his household, forbade him the court, and cut off his allowance so that the heir to the throne was left to trail after the royal progress at a humble distance, borrowing from the king's clerks to keep himself fed. Then came the greater breach. When the prince asked that lands and a great title be granted to Gaveston, the king's answer was fury. In one telling, he turned on his son with the same violence he showed his enemies, and once again the wardrobe accounts preserved the cost, a payment to repair a jewel the king was said to have flung at the prince. And then he did what he did best. He applied pressure with cold, administrative patience. Before the end of his life, he ordered Piers Gaveston out of the kingdom altogether, into exile across the sea, and bound the prince by oath not to recall him. It was a domestic siege, conducted with the very tactics he had once used to starve a Welsh garrison from its walls: the isolation of a target, the cutting of its supplies, the slow, remorseless application of a will that would not bend. He believed he was disciplining a wayward boy into a king. What he was in fact doing was teaching his heir to hate the ministers who ruled in his name, and sowing the seeds of a reign that would tear itself apart within a few short years. But Edward could not see that, or would not. He saw only weakness, and weakness was the single sin he had never in his life been able to forgive, not in his enemies, not in his father, and least of all in the son who would wear his crown. There is something close to pathos in the spectacle, and the chroniclers, who stood in genuine awe of the king's power, hardly knew how to record it. The greatest ruler in Europe, the lawgiver, the castle builder, the hammer of nations, was spending the last of his strength on the hair of his daughter and the friendships of his son, breaking coronets and leaving the goldsmith to be paid. The majesty had not gone. The presence that made grown men afraid to meet his drooping, half-closed eye was there to the end. But it had narrowed and soured. The rage that had once been vast enough to swallow kingdoms was now loose inside a single household, with no war left grand enough to hold it. Ministers watched their words, his children measured his moods before they spoke, and the whole apparatus of the court arranged itself, day after day, around the temper of one failing old man. There had once been a single person who could reach him in such moods, Eleanor of Castile, the wife of 36 years whose steadiness had been the one soft place in a hard life. But she had lain in her tomb more than 15 years now, and the carved crosses he had raised to her memory stood along the southern roads like milestones marking the distance he had traveled from the last of his own gentleness. There was no one left with the love or the standing to lay a hand on his arm and tell him to be still, and then the North gave the rage somewhere to go. For all the blood he had spent to hold Scotland, the sack of Berwick, the theft of its coronation stone, the slow butchery of Wallace, the peace he had bought there had never been more than a held breath. Now the riders began to arrive at his court, and each brought worse news than the last. A man Edward had counted among the broken, a Scottish earl who had knelt and done homage and sworn his faith on holy relics, had turned. Robert the Bruce had spilled blood upon the steps of an altar, taken the crown of Scotland onto his own head, and set the whole country ablaze behind him. Everything the king believed he had settled at such cost was coming undone, and it was coming undone in the one place on earth he could not bear to lose. To a younger man the news would have been a summons to the saddle and nothing more. To this one, old, sick, and already at war within the walls of his own family, it was something far more dangerous. The frustration of his failing body, the bitterness of his ruined hopes for his son, and the fresh, intolerable insult from the north all began to fuse into a single, consuming purpose. He had spent 67 years proving that no force on earth could stand against his will, and he would not allow his last act to be a retreat. The rage that had conquered a country was turning inward now on his own blood, and news from Scotland was about to set it blazing higher than ever. It began, as so much of Edward's story did, with blood on holy ground. On the 10th of February, 1306, in the church of the Greyfriars at Dumfries, Robert the Bruce met John Comyn, his rival for the leadership of Scotland, and a man with as good a claim as his own to speak for the Scottish cause, before the high altar. What passed between them is not certainly known. What is known is that the meeting ended with Comyn stabbed and dying on the altar steps, finished off, by most accounts, by Bruce's companions after Bruce himself had struck the first blow. It was murder and it was sacrilege, the two crimes that Edward of England, a man of rigid and literal piety, could least forgive. And it was something else besides. It was the act of a man who had at last stopped calculating, for Bruce had spent years calculating. He had shifted between the English king and the Scottish cause more than once, doing homage to Edward when it served him, and slipping away when it did not, a great magnate playing the long odds of a divided country. The killing of Comyn ended all of that. There could be no more fence-sitting now, no more quiet submission and patient waiting. He had cut down the head of the most powerful family in Scotland on consecrated stone, and he had only two roads left before him, the gallows or the throne. He chose the throne. Within 7 weeks, on the 25th of March, he was crowned King of Scots at Scone, upon the ancient mound where Scottish kings had always been made. The murder in the Greyfriars carried a second cost too, beyond Comyn's blood. For spilling it upon holy ground, the church pronounced Bruce excommunicate, cut off from the sacraments, shut out of grace, and, in the eyes of Rome, damned. Edward would make full and cynical use of that. It let him dress his vengeance in the robes of holy war, not a king crushing a rival for a crown, but a Christian prince scourging a sacrilegious outlaw whom God himself had already cast out. And here the story circles back to a woman on a wall. By old and jealously guarded right, it was the Earls of Fife who placed the crown upon the head of a new Scottish king. But the young Earl of Fife was in English hands and could not, or dared not, come. So his aunt came in his place. Isabella Macduff, Countess of Buchan, married to one of the murdered Comyn's own kinsmen, slipped away from her husband, took his horses and rode hard for Scone to claim her family's ancient office. She arrived a day or two after the ceremony, and so Bruce was crowned a second time, that the thing might be done properly, with a Macduff's hands upon the circlet. It was a gesture of raw defiance, and everyone understood it as such. She had defied her family, her husband, and the King of England to set the crown on a rebel's head. Edward would remember her name. When the news reached him, Edward did not respond as a king responds to a rebellion. He responded as a man responds to a personal betrayal. He had been ill, carried much of the time in a litter. The reports from the north acted on him like a goad. He would not treat this as war, with war's grim courtesies, the ransoms, the exchanges, the quarter offered to men of rank. He declared, in effect, that the ordinary rules were suspended. Bruce and all who stood with him were not enemies but traitors, and traitors had no rights that a king was bound to honor. The machinery of his vengeance began to turn, and it turned with a cold and terrible efficiency. At first, fortune did his work for him. Bruce's rising went badly. He was beaten in the field at Methven that summer, hunted through the heather, driven into hiding among the Western Isles, his little kingdom scattered almost as soon as it was made. And as his cause collapsed, his people fell into English hands one by one, and Edward showed them what his new rules meant. When his brother Nigel Bruce was taken at the fall of Kildrummy Castle, he was given no soldier's death. He was carried to Berwick, condemned, hanged, and beheaded, a king's brother butchered like a common felon. John of Strathbogie, Earl of Athol, was caught trying to flee by sea and sent to London, and because he pleaded his kinship to the royal house, hoping his blood would save him, Edward answered the plea with a grim joke. He had the earl hanged on a gallows built higher than the rest, so that all might see he had honored the noble blood, and then beheaded and his body burned. Athol was the first earl to be put to death in England in more than 200 years, and it was said that the king's justice reached even to boys, youths barely old enough to bear arms sent to the rope for the crime of having followed the wrong lord. Edward did not want Scotland merely defeated. He wanted it terrified into silence, and he was prepared to hang the young to do it. But it was in what he did to the women that his malice found its strangest and most enduring form. He understood, as cruel men often do, that death can be a kind of mercy, that a quick end on the scaffold can make a martyr, and that a martyr is more dangerous dead than alive. So for the women who had defied him, he devised something worse than death. A punishment with no end in it, and nothing merciful about it. The orders survive in his own writs, set down in the flat, procedural language of royal command, and they are among the coldest documents his reign ever produced. For Isabella Macduff, the countess who had crowned his enemy, the king commanded that a cage be built. It was to be a chamber of stout latticework, strengthened with iron, and it was to be set in a turret of Berwick Castle, upon the wall, where the town could see it. In it she was to be shut, and there she was to stay. She was to be given her food and drink, but no one was to speak to her save the English women set to guard her. She was to have no comfort, no company, and no release. The writ thought of everything. It provided even that she might use a privy within the turret, so that her most private necessity was accounted for in the same cold breath that condemned her to years in the open air. The tidiness of a mind that could arrange a woman's degradation down to its smallest particular and feel no need to look away. The wind off the North Sea would pass through the lattice, so would the rain, and the eyes of every soldier and townsman who walked beneath. She was not to be killed. She was to be displayed, a great lady turned into a caged animal on a wall, kept there not for a day or a season but for years, so that a whole country might look up at her and learn what it cost to defy the King of England. A few days' ride away, at Roxburgh, the same fate was prepared for Mary Bruce, the new king's sister. Another cage, another turret, another woman set out against the stone to endure in the open air and the public gaze. Bruce's wife, Elizabeth, was spared the cage only because she was of too great a family to risk it. She was the daughter of an Irish earl who was one of Edward's own allies, and so she was merely locked away under guard in England, her life dismantled, her marriage made a prison. His young daughter Marjorie was sent to a convent, and there is a tradition that a cage was ordered even for the child to hang at the Tower of London, and though it seems in the end it was never used, the fact that the thing was so much as written down tells its own story about the temper of the court that produced it. A whole family of women erased into cages, cloisters and locked rooms for the single crime of belonging to Robert the Bruce. The chroniclers who recorded all this were, many of them, men who admired Edward, and they could not easily reconcile what they saw. The king who had given England its great statutes, who had summoned its parliaments and reformed its common law, was now spending the last of his strength on the carpentry of cages and the hanging of boys. The great lawgiver had become the great jailer, and in the cages he made plain what his celebrated law had always been, at bottom, only another name for his will. Where his will required justice, there was justice. Where it required a countess on a wall, there was a countess on a wall. The two were never in tension for him. They were the same instrument, turned to different work. And here was the deepest irony of all, the one the old king could not see. The terror did not work. It never truly had, though it had always looked as though it did. Every execution he ordered made a legend. Every cage he bolted to a wall guaranteed that the woman inside it would be remembered and mourned and spoken of in 1,000 cottages long after the timber had rotted away. He had set out to break an idea with chains and gallows, and instead he was forging it harder, turning a doomed rebellion into a national grief and a hunted fugitive into the king a whole people would not stop believing in. The countess endured on her wall for 4 long years. Scotland did not forget her. It remembered, but Edward was past learning such lessons now. He was 67 and dying, and he could feel the time running out of him. He was surrounded by the monuments of his greatness, the soaring crosses raised for his dead queen, the vast castles of his Welsh wars, the parliaments and the statutes that would outlive him by centuries. And none of it could give him the one thing he now wanted above all others, which was to see Robert the Bruce dead before he himself died. He would not leave his son a kingdom with a crowned rival still breathing in the north. The blood on the altar at Dumfries, the brother hanged at Berwick, the earl swinging from his high gallows, the women shut in their cages. All of it was carrying him toward a single final reckoning. There was no cruelty left he would not sanction to break Scotland. And so, one last time, the old and dying king had himself lifted into the saddle and turned north. There is a particular horror in a strong man's refusal to die, and Edward gave it its fullest and most terrible expression in the last months of his life. He had passed the winter of 1306 into 1307 laid up at Leopard Priory, a house of quiet canons a few miles from Carlisle, and he had very nearly died there. For close to 5 months the King of England lay sick in a borrowed religious house, too weak to travel, while his war against the Bruce guttered on without him. By any reasonable measure he was a dying man. The dysentery that had gnawed at him for years had hollowed him out. He was thin and grey, and often too weak to stand unaided, let alone to arm himself and ride. He was in his 68th year, older than almost any king his subjects could remember. Every instinct of sense and mercy pointed toward a quiet end in a warm chamber in the south. But sense and mercy had never governed Edward, and they did not begin now. Through the spring the news came south, and all of it was bad. Robert the Bruce, so lately a hunted fugitive with a price on his head, had crept back out of the west. He was winning again. At Loudon Hill in May, he had met and beaten an English force in the open field, choosing his ground with care and breaking a mounted charge on foot, and the shock of it ran through the whole northern command. The rebellion that Edward believed he had drowned in blood the year before was rising a second time, and rising, this time, around a king who was learning how to win. The news did to the old man what no physician could. It put him back on his feet. He would go north himself, one last time, and finish with his own hand the thing his lieutenants could not finish for him. So began one of the strangest campaigns of his long reign, a march that was less an invasion than a procession toward a grave. He could not ride for more than a mile or two at a stretch, and much of the way he was carried in a litter, a sick old man borne slowly northward through the early summer, refusing every counsel to turn back. The royal itinerary, kept day by day as it always was, records the progress of a man being outrun by his own death. In the last weeks the court crept barely 2 miles between one halt and the next. The whole apparatus of an English king, the clerks and chaplains, the wardrobe and the guard, inching across the border country at the pace of a failing heart. Those around him could see plainly what he would not admit, that the King of England was dying and that he meant to spend the very last of himself hurling his failing body at Scotland, as though he could subdue it simply by refusing to die before he reached it. Every mile was a small war against his own flesh. He won each of them, and it cost him everything he had left. He came at last to Berwick Sands, a poor village on the flat marshes of the Solway Firth, a few miles from Carlisle and within sight of Scotland across the water. He could go no further. He was so weak now that his servants had to lift him even to move from his bed. And there, on the very edge of the country he had spent his life trying to break, his body finally gave out. On the 7th of July, 1307, being raised in the arms of his attendants to take a little food, Edward I died. He was 68 years old. The land he had failed to conquer lay in plain view across the firth, grey and level and utterly indifferent, close enough to see and forever beyond his reach. For a few days the great secret was kept. Such a death, on campaign and within sight of the enemy, could not be announced lightly, and the household closed around it, holding the news while riders went south to fetch the heir, and the succession was quietly made safe. And while the old king lay dead in his tent on the marsh, a few hours' ride away, his cruelty still hung on the wall where he had left it. The Countess of Buchan was in her cage at Berwick yet, and Mary Bruce in hers at Roxburgh, and Edward's dying changed nothing for either of them. The women he had condemned would keep their vigils in the open air for 3 more years, long after the hand that signed the writ was cold, the last patient proof that his cruelty had never depended on his presence to go on working. It is here, at the deathbed, that legend takes over from record, and it must be handled with care. It was said the chronicler Froissart set it down decades afterward, and others repeated it, that with his last breath Edward laid a terrible charge upon his son and the lords about him. He is said to have commanded that his body be boiled until the flesh fell from the bones, and that his skeleton be carried at the head of the English army into every future campaign, so that even in death he might lead the war until the last of the Scots was subdued, and that his heart be cut out and carried to the Holy Land in payment of the crusading vow of his youth. It is a story shaped with perfect fitness to the man, which is exactly why it must be doubted. Whether Edward truly gave such an order cannot be proved, and the plain facts argue against it. His body was not boiled, and it was not carried at the head of any army. It was embalmed whole and borne with slow ceremony south to London, and there in time it was buried. And when, nearly 5 centuries later, a party of curious antiquaries opened his tomb, they found the king lying entire within it, wrapped and robed, his long body still measuring the 6 feet and more that had earned him his name, the flesh never stripped, the bones never marched to war. The command, if it was ever spoken, was never obeyed. But that men so readily believed he had given it is its own kind of verdict on how he was remembered, as a king who could not imagine even his own death as anything but a weapon of the state. For the reality of what followed his death was not the endless ghost-led conquest of the legend. It was collapse. Edward had held the English grip on Scotland shut by the sheer crushing force of a single will. It was his tirelessness, his refusal ever to compromise or forgive or stop, that had made the occupation seem inevitable. And the moment that will was gone, the inevitability went with it. The crown passed to his son, now Edward II, a man of wholly different temper, who had inherited his father's throne and none of his father's terrible patience. The great army that had gathered for the final blow against Bruce did not strike it. The new king went through the motions of a campaign, advanced a little way into the southwest of Scotland, found nothing there he wished to fight for, and turned back south within a few weeks, drawn away by his own concerns, and above all by his longing to recall the banished friend his father had driven into exile. The war engine the old king had spent years and a fortune perfecting was simply allowed to fall still. The supply lines withered. The garrisons in their lonely Scottish castles, no longer feeling the old king's gaze upon them, found themselves suddenly isolated in hostile country, waiting for orders and reinforcements that would not come. And into that vacuum stepped the man Edward had died hating. Robert the Bruce, who a year before had been a fugitive with a price on his head and his women in cages, now had what he had never once possessed while the old king lived: time and room to breathe. He used both. First he turned on his enemies within Scotland, breaking the power of the Comyns whose kinsmen he had murdered, harrying their northern lands until no rival was left to challenge him at home. Then he turned on the English garrisons, and here he showed how much he had learned from the master he had fought so long. He would not hold the great castles and wait to be besieged, as Edward had taught the world to do. He took them, one after another, and then he threw them down, slighting the walls, filling the wells, making the strongholds useless to any army that might come after him, so that the ring of stone the old king had trusted to hold the land could never be turned against its own people again. Slowly, patiently, castle by castle and county by county, he took back his country, undoing in the years after Edward's death the work of the decade before it. Everything the hammer had built in Scotland by terror and by engineering began, quietly at first and then unstoppably, to come apart. The old king was carried the long road south toward the abbey at Westminster, where his family had made their tomb. He had died still certain that his will could reach beyond the grave, that the mere memory of him would be enough to hold a conquered nation down. He was wrong about that, as it turned out, more completely and more swiftly than about almost anything else in his long life. The hammer of the Scots died still swinging and hating, and within a year the anvil had survived him and begun to strike back. They buried him at Westminster, in the abbey his family had made their own, beneath a tomb unlike any other in that crowded church of gilded and painted kings. It is a plain, blunt chest of black marble without effigy or ornament, startlingly severe among its decorated neighbors, as though even in death he refused to soften. And on its side, painted there by a later hand, runs the epitaph that history has agreed to accept as his Edwardus Primus Scotorum Malleus Hic Est. Here lies Edward I, the hammer of the Scots. And beside it, 2 words more, Pactum Serva. Keep faith. There is no line that better captures the distance between the legend and the man. For if there was one thing Edward had not kept across a long life of broken truces and bent oaths and homage extracted at the point of a sword, it was faith. He had kept his ambitions, he had kept his hatreds to the grave and past it. But faith, the plain word given and honored, had always been for him a thing to be used when it was useful and discarded when it was not, from the treacheries of his youth to the humiliations he heaped on the Scots who had trusted him to be their judge. That his tomb should command the one virtue he least practiced, above the boast of the very conquest that came undone the moment he died, is the truest and most accidental honesty on the whole of that black stone. We are left, then, with 2 men who wore the same crown, and any honest reckoning has to hold them both. There is the Edward of the textbooks, the great king, and the word is not simply wrong. His mark on England is deeper than that of almost any monarch who ever ruled it. He took a tangle of feudal custom and half-remembered precedent, and forged it into something like a coherent common law, in a series of great statutes that would still be cited in English courts 6 and 7 centuries after his death. He summoned the Parliament of 1295 that later ages would call the Model Parliament, calling knights and burgesses to sit alongside the lords and prelates and giving voice, however cynically and however much he meant it as a means of raising money for his wars, to a principle that would outlast every castle he ever built, that what touches all should be approved by all. He reformed the coinage and the machinery of government. He gave the English state a reach and a competence it had never had before. He was a man of real intelligence and real energy, a patron of great building, and, in the one wholly human corner of his life, a husband who loved his wife, Eleanor of Castile, with a devotion rare in any age, and who, when she died, raised 12 carved crosses along the road her body travelled to its rest, so that even a king's grief was written across the map of England in stone. Look at the foundations of the English state, and much of what you are looking at was laid by his hands. That is real. It does not wash out. But there is the other Edward, the one the little word great was built to bury, and his achievements do not sit politely beside his cruelties, as if the two had nothing to do with each other. They were cut from the same cold cloth. The same mind that could draft a statute could design a cage. The same patience that mastered the law mastered the arts of terror, and the same conviction that drove all of it, that a king's will must be made absolute, whatever the cost in other people's lives, was the engine of the building and the breaking alike. Consider the year 1290. It was the year his beloved Eleanor died, and it was also the year he committed the act that should weigh heaviest of all against his name. By a single edict, he expelled every Jew from England, the whole community, ordered out of the only country most of them had ever known, to be gone by the 1st of November. By the counts that survive, some 2,000 to 3,000 people were driven out, though older estimates run far higher, and whatever the true number, the cruelty was total. It did not come from nowhere. For a generation they had been treated as the crown's private property, taxed toward ruin and beyond it. The statute of the jury of 1275 had stripped them of their livelihood and forced them to wear a badge of shame, and in the coin-clipping panic of 1278 and 1279, some 269 had been hanged in London alone. The expulsion completed the work. The crown seized their houses, their goods, and the debts owed to them, and turned a whole people's ruin to its own profit. These were not strangers to England. Their families had lived in London and Lincoln, in York and Norwich and Oxford for more than 200 years. Since the Conqueror's day, England was the only home their children had ever known. They left it with what they could carry, and there was no country anywhere waiting to receive them. The chronicles record that a shipmaster carrying a group of the exiles down the Thames ran his vessel aground on the falling tide, urged them out onto the sand, and then abandoned them to drown as the water rose, and that he was afterward hanged for it. It was the first time a European kingdom had cast out an entire people by law, and the ban would not be lifted for 366 years. Edward oversaw it with the same meticulous care he gave to the raising of his castles. And those castles, which we call masterpieces and photograph in their thousands, were never only beautiful. They were engines of conquest, a ring of stone thrown around a beaten nation to make certain it could never rise again. He had broken Wales not merely in battle but as a society, and when the last native prince, Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, was killed, his severed head was sent to London and crowned in mockery with ivy. His brother Dafydd was dragged through the streets of Shrewsbury and became one of the first men, and by many accounts the very first, to suffer the full, elaborated horror of the traitor's death, hanged, cut down while still living, disembowelled, beheaded and quartered. That death was, in large part, Edward's own invention, a piece of legal theatre designed so that the end of a rebel should be not a killing merely, but a long, public, unforgettable spectacle of the power of the crown. He carried the same theatre north. At Berwick in 1296 the slaughter was so great that the chronicler's numbers cannot be trusted, but the horror of it was remembered along the border for generations. He carried off the Stone of Scone to Westminster to declare that Scottish kingship itself had ceased to exist. He had William Wallace disembowelled alive and his entrails burned before his dying eyes and his quarters nailed up in 4 towns as a warning. And when Isabella Macduff, Countess of Buchan, dared to set the crown on the head of Robert the Bruce, he did not treat her as a prisoner of war. He built a cage and hung it on a castle wall at Berwick and left her in it for 4 years. In the wind and the rain and the sight of the town, a woman turned into a spectacle so that a nation might look up and learn to be afraid. That is where this film began, with the Countess on the wall, and it is where it has to end too, because she is the whole argument in a single image. She was not the excess of a cruel age, nor the accident of a bad temper. She was policy, deliberate, documented and signed in the king's own hand. The same is true of the boys he hanged, and the earl on his high gallows, and the people he drove into the sea. This was not the wild violence of a madman. That would almost be easier to forgive. It was the consistent, reasoned, patient policy of a brilliant man who had decided early and completely that the way to hold a throne was to make the price of defiance unbearable. He was the king of whom it was said he tore his daughter's hair and hurled a coronet into the fire, and he was the king who could sit for weeks in a cold tent working the supply of an army like a problem in arithmetic. And those were never two different men. They were one. This is why the word great is so dangerous, and why it has done such quiet work for 700 years. It lets us keep the castles and the statues and set the cages out of sight. It lets us look at the tomb and read Hammer of the Scots, and nod, as though a hammer were a thing to admire, and not a thing that exists only to fall on something softer than itself. It teaches us, without ever quite saying so, that a strong state is worth its cost in other people's bodies, that the expelled and the conquered and the caged are simply the friction of progress, the price of the order, and the laws we are grateful to have inherited. But history is not a ledger, and the statutes do not cancel the slaughter. Both are real, both are his. He was a founder who built his house upon a grave, and this is the strangest part of the whole reckoning. Nearly everything that 3 nations have carried down the centuries flows back to the same cold, brilliant, merciless man, the English Parliament, and the common law that half the world would one day borrow, his. The oldest griefs of the Welsh, the long bitterness of the Scots, and the wound he opened by expelling a people that took 3.5 centuries to close, his also, and from the very same hand. The cage on the wall at Berwick has long since rotted to nothing. The bodies of the executed are dust, the castles are ruins full of visitors now, and the laws have been rewritten 100 times over. But the shadow of the hammer still falls across everything we mean when we call a king or a country great. We are living still in the world that he built, and we have still not decided what it should cost us to be told that the building was worth the graves it stands on.